This video is sponsored by Care of, my dearest Jelizabeth. I've lost count of the years it has been since you died. Time seems to have stood still the day I lowered your body into the grave, knowing it was only the day prior that we were wed. Had I known then what I know now, perhaps I may have saved you. Every day I grieve and drown in my regrets, but as I gaze at your face, this last photograph of you, when you still walked this earth alive, I remembered that you would not have wished me to fall to despair. People are vanishing in town, young children appearing drained of their lifeblood, and none but I can put an end to it. All my love, until undeath do us part. I won't let you nor anyone else suffer any longer. Seems a bit dramatic, right? But for a large number of communities in the late 1800s, this type of scenario where someone might set out to exhume the corpse of their beloved family member, believing they might be a vampire terrorizing the community, wasn't really that unheard of. It was, however, considered rare and extremely superstitious. As with any time period, people are never a monolith, and where the vampire crazes ran rampant, so followed considerable discussion and ridicule from bystanders. But what caused these beliefs and rampages to happen in the first place? And how did they give birth to our modern popular idea of vampire hunting? And what the hell is up with those super expensive antique vampire defense kits? Come learn with me. But just a quick disclaimer before we begin. This video will largely focus on vampire lore from the US and Western Europe, generally because that's the realm of vampire pop culture that I'm trying to backtrace. Vampire and vampire hunting lore appears in various forms all over the world, which I would love to touch on in future videos, but as I only have so much time to make this video, and I've already tried recording it 3 times, I don't want to rush through those other regions like they are an afterthought, so I'll narrow the scope for now. So with that said, let's get into it. But first, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, Care of. I guess you could say I'm on a personal wellness journey, but keeping track of what supplements and vitamins I need to take is honestly really stressful, which is why I've been loving using Care of because they make it super easy to stick to a consistent vitamin routine. Care of is a subscription service that ships high-quality, personalized vitamins to your door every month. All you have to do is complete their super straightforward quiz to lay out your health goals and needs, and they curate a list of recommended vitamins and supplements for you to choose from. Then each month they arrive at your doorstep in this super convenient packaging, and your daily dosage is in these little packets. I've added some new things to my routine, such as collagen and keratin on top of what I've already been using for a long time, like astaxanthin and probiotics. Plus, their free app includes daily reminders to take your vitamins, and it also rewards you for consistency, so you can earn stuff like discounts and merch just by tracking your progress in the app. I've been working on improving my morning routine by doing things like organized stretching and mindfulness exercises, and hardest of all, waking up at the same time every day. And this way I can easily include high quality supplements in there too, so I can stay consistent and see better results in the long term. Head to the link in the description below to take Care of's quiz to find out what's recommended for you, and then use my code CAS50 for 50% off your first order. Thank you so much to Care of for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about the history of vampire hunting. For as long as vampires have existed in folklore, people have sought ways to vanquish them. What constitutes a vampire is different depending on what part of the world you're in. In the Caribbean, there is the legend of the Sucuyant, a female creature who slips out of her skin at night and transforms into a fiery specter who moves from house to house, sucking blood from the inhabitants. In Turkish and Slavic history, vampires and witches are often intertwined, and sometimes even non-human things can become vampires, even pumpkins or watermelons. The Philippines has the shape-shifting Mandarugo and Manananggal, and Chinese folklore talks about hungry ghosts, but for our purposes today, we'll stick with the most popular incarnation of vampires to date, that of a former human trapped between life and death who rises at night from their grave to drink the blood of the living, a cursed, immortal state of being which is contagious. I think it's pretty obvious for me to say that the origin of vampire myth is, simply put, fear of death and the dead. Wayne Bartlett and Flavia Idrisianu write in Legends of Blood, "Our fears make fantastic stories seem true. Humanity has often believed that we share our world with good or evil spirits, fabulous beings, and strange creatures, sometimes helpful, sometimes menacing and vengeful. For centuries, pain and illness were thought to be caused by evil spirits, which could be summoned by a witch or wizard, beliefs that still exist in some parts of the world. Fear of death and of the souls of the departed departed being trapped on Earth was at the origin of burial rituals. When these were not respected and something went wrong, the dead would not find peace and would come back to punish the living. As I discussed in my video on medieval death culture, the Middle Ages was a time period where the idea of people rising from their graves was immensely popular. There are folktales of bodies coming back from the grave to do all sorts of mundane things, like baking bread or doing laundry, but they could also be antagonistic too. William of Malmesbury wrote that the devil would reanimate the bodies of evil men and compels them to act as he desires. More recognizably, William of Newburgh wrote in the 1100s about the vampire of Alnwick Castle, a man who lived a depraved and dishonest life and died returning from the grave as a vengeful spectre. He was seen at night walking around and spreading pestilent air, and to save the village, a group of people with the local priest dug up his body and burned him on a pyre. This will become a trend. What's interesting, though, is the fact that these medieval European folk legends were limited to the peasant class and were extremely widespread despite the generally stationary lives of the peasantry. This could be possibly explained by the fact that many churches accepted the idea of vampirism, and the 15th century book Malleus Maleficarum was a popular sort of manual detailing how to hunt and take down various forms of witchcraft which was associated with vampires. And the minute vampires drifted from peasant folklore into the realm of Christianity, it suddenly became a convenient tool for the church to use to reinforce its own power, as they made to associate the vampire as a creature in league with the devil. The church saw these vampire stories as a good opportunity to frighten people away from sin, as a cornerstone of medieval vampire tales is that the vampire was made so after having lived a life of sin. As a creature formed by fear, the vampire is informed by a number of intersecting social conditions, all of which evolve over time. I talked about this quite a lot in my video on Bram Stoker and Dracula, but throughout history, vampires are frequently, though often subconsciously, direct stand-ins for whatever social issue people were worried about at the time. After they represented the fear of death and decay, they represented a fear of immigrants, queerness, Slavic people, Jewish people, women. Many vampires, especially within the last 200 years, are coded in a markedly queer way, both in regards to gender and sexuality. Alexa Way writes in Adaptable Monsters, the past, present, and future of the vampire narrative as a metaphor for marginalized groups. In order to obliterate gender, one must accept death. But because we live in a society that treats the gender binary and gender as a construct in general as a universal truth, we cannot accept death fully. Death remains shadowy, hidden, and occult as long as we cling to illusions of gender and immortality. That vampires often transgress gender roles in the binary hints at the obliteration of gender that death can offer. Genderless beings who simply exist, free of the constraints gender distinctions create. They have seen death and defeated it, and therefore have no need for the false sense of security the fantasy of gender provides, like a protective talisman against death. It's not really a coincidence that as the xenophobia of the 19th century gave us Dracula, and whether she ever wanted to admit it or not, the reckoning with the gay rights movement in the 60s and 70s gave us Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, we are now amidst a social upheaval with regards to trans rights, and a reevaluation of our gender systems, which has, as a result, degendered vampires more than ever before. Dracula in particular is a perfect case study in literature that represents the Western European fear of reverse colonization. The book begins with Jonathan Harker's observations on the backwards, uncivilized society of Transylvania, which is quickly evolved into a story of a Transylvanian count quite literally entering England with the intent of draining its people of their lifeblood and starting a new race, a clear parallel to a fear of immigrants coming in and dirtying society, draining it of its resources and purity. But in the context of Victorian attitudes towards Eastern Europeans, it's written extremely plainly. Eastern Europeans at the time were seen by Western Europeans as inherently backwards and lesser. A lot of this is informed not only by a disdain for those who live in poverty, but also due to the huge population of Jewish people and Roma who were living in and immigrating from Eastern Europe. While it's true that Stoker in part chose this location due to its historical vampire myths he was loosely pulling from, it needs to be acknowledged the political climate he was writing in, where at the time, Transylvania wasn't known in the West for its vampires. It was known for its political and racial struggles. Indeed, Stoker transformed his Transylvanian vampire from, traditionally, the bloated, red-haired, and blue-eyed, unmistakably corpse-like Moroi into a more human-looking man, with physical characteristics that would have read to Victorians as stereotypically anti-Semitic, and follows the trails of common anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Alexa Way continues, Dracula is inherently monstrous by belonging to the vampire race, but his goal of fathering a new vampire race in England allows vampirism to stand in for ethnicity even as it links the two. Stoker chose Transylvania for its history of real-life vampire accounts and superstition, but also paints Transylvania as a violent, war-torn racial melting pot, the antithesis to the ideal of English racial homogeneity. Therefore, he is not only monstrous because he is a literal monster, but because he belongs to what Stoker and other contemporaries of Lombroso would have viewed as a more primitive race of, quote, born criminals who lack the moral capacity of their more Western and white peers. As I tried to emphasize in my video on Dracula, this does not mean you can't enjoy Dracula or that I'm trying to cancel Bram Stoker or say that he wrote Dracula with the intention to be a xenophobic anti-Semite. I mean, for fuck's sake, I love Dracula and Carmilla and honestly most historical vampire fiction. What I'm saying is, all of these things informed the narrative. All horror is inherently informed by the social climate it's created in, and vampires are an especially poignant litmus test for society's fears. There's a reason why so many marginalized groups identify with vampires and other classic monsters. It's because society saw us as these monsters first. So, as expected, both vampire fiction and real-life vampire believers were extremely preoccupied with the particulars of how one might kill a vampire. Some lore began with the belief that a vampire must be vanquished by cutting off its head and reburying it at a crossroads or something like that, so as to make it lost or confused. Later lore introduced the concept of destroying the vampire's heart with a stake or other weapon, or burning it to death, or exposing it to the sunlight. And so through every vampire scare that periodically cropped up through history, fearful people would pick up their shovels and head to the graveyards and cemeteries to try and rid their communities of a real or imagined threat. Usually what was in reality just disease, but sometimes was made up altogether. They would exhume a number of bodies, looking for corpses that seemed to be either not decomposed or not decomposed enough. If the body seemed to be bloated or had blood around the mouth, it's a vampire. If its hair or nails seemed much longer, vampire. If they seemed unusually lifelike, vampire. What we know now that people back then didn't have the privilege of knowing is that all of this is a natural part of decomposition. The body doesn't just stop functioning completely the minute you die, it continues to change. The skin recedes, giving the impression of growing hair and nails, and gas buildup in the body can give a bloated appearance. Certain diseases, especially tuberculosis, can cause blood to leak from a dead person's mouth up from the lungs. Disease, obviously, is the root of a lot of these folkloric symptoms. For example, in the Middle Ages, people with porphyria would experience an aversion to sunlight, paleness, elongated teeth, and sometimes excess hair, and following the logic of medieval medical theory, some of them likely tried to drink blood as a cure. Go watch my video on ancient artifacts to learn more about medieval blood and corpse medicine. Now, just a quick tangent here, one thing they didn't do was lock vampires into graves with iron cages. These cages that you see in some old cemeteries were actually used to protect the recently deceased body from being stolen by body snatchers or resurrectionists or resurrection men. They were called all number of things. To be sold to medical schools and the doctors to be used for dissection and anatomical study. This was a very common thing around the 1700s to 1800s because obviously scientists wanted to learn about the body, but who the hell was going to sell their body to science at this point? So dudes were making good money by digging up buried bodies and selling them to schools and such. It was such a huge problem because obviously they were only targeting poor people's graves. So, yeah. If you slap a cage over that bad boy, there's less of a chance you're going to see your dearly departed relative's half-dissected body floating around a medical school the next week. So, there you go. It's not vampires. Tangent over. On one of the earliest accounts of a stake in the heart vampire killing comes from the 1732 story of a Serbian man named and I'm so sorry, I'm probably going to butcher this, Arnold Paole, who returned home from serving in the army in Greece. He strangely seemed uninterested in marrying his neighbor's daughter Mina, but eventually did so, and later confided in her that while in Greece, he was visited by a vampire. He destroyed it and ate some of the dirt from its grave to try and protect himself from its curse, but he still felt like he'd been cursed anyway. He died a few weeks later after falling off of a hay wagon and breaking his neck. After this, villagers reported seeing Arnold around the village and claimed that he had killed 4 people. So, 4 officers arrived to exhume him. They found that his body had moved to one side of his grave, his jaw open with blood spilling out. The officers poured garlic onto his body and drove a stake through his heart, after which a horrible scream erupted from Arnold's body and blood gushed out. Arnold was never seen outside of his grave again. For about 50 years in the 1700s, the vampire dominated popular European discourse with regards to whether or not they existed. Most people considered it a ridiculous idea, but just enough people thought it could be possible that instances of vampire stakings occurred periodically until about 1770, when all the excitement died out. But, of course, as usual, the vampire would not stay dead for long, as it was reborn in the 1800s in the world of fiction, reintroducing the idea to new generations, in particular, the highly superstitious fringe populations growing in the United States. On March 19, 1892, the Providence Journal ran a front-page headline reading, "Exhumed the bodies, testing a horrible superstition in the town of Exeter, bodies of dead relatives taken from their graves." The article, of course, was talking about a horrific incident that happened in Exeter, Rhode Island, a small, quiet town about 30 minutes outside of Providence. It's a place crisscrossed by old stone walls, dotted with spread-out homes, and filled with a rural expanse that I'm very much not used to. The Brown family lived here in the late 1800s, and in 1883, the mother of the family, Mary Eliza, passed away from tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it in those days. She was the wife of George Brown, a well-respected farmer, and had a few children. 7 months later, their daughter Mary Olive also died of consumption. Through the next few years, their son Edwin began showing symptoms of the disease too. Panicked that he may lose another child, George sent his son to Colorado for a change of air, but it didn't help that much, and Edwin returned home. By the time he got home, the last Brown daughter, 19-year-old Mercy Lena Brown, had contracted the disease as well. She passed away rapidly and was buried at Chestnut Hill Cemetery in 1892, and the people of Exeter began to get panicked, knowing that if consumption could wipe out one family, it could come for theirs next. And they pleaded with George Brown to save himself and his final child by turning to folk superstition. They believed that one of the dead Brown women was rising from the grave to feed on the lifeblood and flesh of poor Edwin, and the only way to discover if it's true or not is to exhume them and see if any of them have blood in them. Afraid for his son's life and pressured by the increasingly anxious neighbors and family members, George Brown finally agreed. On the morning of March 17th, a group of men went to Chestnut Hill and unearthed Mary Eliza and Mary Olive, both of whom had been dead for years at this point, so obviously they were devoid of blood and were decomposing properly. So then they dug up Mercy, who had now only been dead for a couple of months, and big shocker here, she was not fully decomposed, and she still had blood in her heart. Intent on finishing the job, the men removed her heart and liver and burnt it to ash, which they fed to Edwin in an attempt to cure him. Unfortunately, it was all for nothing. Edwin would die only 2 months later. I wanted in on the action, so I hopped on a plane to Boston and joined forces with my college roommate and bestie Sage to go look for Mercy Brown's grave. Just about an hour and a half drive outside of Boston, which equals like 5 minutes LA driving time, past Providence and into the countryside, we entered the little town of Exeter, and the weather must have known we were coming because it was cold and rainy and foggy, which I loved. It didn't take long to find Mercy's grave underneath this nice tree, as it was covered in little gifts and trinkets left for her by her visitors, which I think is really nice. So I left her a shiny nickel. I hope she appreciated it because that's like $2 if you calculate it for 120 years worth of inflation. Maybe she can get herself like a ghost Snickers bar or something. Side note, Sage discovered that Mercy Brown's grave is apparently a Pokestop in Pokemon Go, so there you go. But anyway, to make any sense of the Mercy Brown vampire story, you need to understand that when we're looking at these cases of hyper-superstitious history, we know a massive number of vital things that these people didn't. They had never heard of germs, most likely, and were grappling with a notoriously confusing and irregular disease that has symptoms and post-mortem displays that fall cleanly in line with a lot of frightening folk beliefs. And honestly, death and fear of death, especially when the unknown is involved, makes people do really weird things. It calls to mind for me the unbelievable crap that people were doing to try and avoid COVID in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when none of us knew how this virus worked. When it seems like no one around you has answers and you and your family could die, you kind of just start throwing spaghetti at the wall and relying on whatever beliefs you already have. And, well, these people in rural New England very much believed in the power of the risen undead. I mean, it makes sense. What, logically, did they know for sure? Life comes from the blood, the heart gives us life, disease preys upon the innocent, etc. These opened up the one theoretical possibility at saving the town from death that George Brown hadn't exhausted yet. That one of the women in his family was a vampire. If he said no to his neighbor's pleas and still more people died, how could he live with himself? It seems clear from the historical record we have that George Brown didn't believe that Mercy was a vampire, but leaning towards what little hope there was left, he didn't have much of a choice. Although I'm extending grace and understanding towards George Brown and the people of Exeter here, I still think it was absolutely horrific, and most other people from that era did too. The Providence Journal went on to declare, "The shocking case of exhumation in one of the border towns of this state last week is, after all, only a rather more than usually striking illustration of a truth which cannot be denied, that the amount of ignorance and superstition to be found in some corners of New England is more than surprising to one who comes into contact with it for the first time. There are considerable elements of rural population in this part of the country upon which the forces of education and civilization have made scarcely any impression." As this article implies, vampirism was kind of a fixation for a number of rural New England communities in the late 1700s to 1800s. Over the course of several decades, story after story crops up where families dug up their dead loved ones, usually the women, discovered blood in their bodies, and burned their hearts to try and stop the trail of death. Even as far back as the American Revolution, there is a story of a guy named Snuffy Stukely, who had 14 children. One night he had a dream where half of the orchard he owned died, and shortly after this his daughter Sarah died of consumption. One by one, 6 of his children died, and his wife said that Sarah was visiting them every night from beyond the grave. To save his family, Snuffy was told to exhume the bodies of his dead children, which he did. All of their hearts were removed and burned, and when they got to Sarah's body, they found it in perfect condition, even though she had died first. So clearly she was a vampire. They burned her heart too, and then after a 7th child died, peace finally came to the family, because Snuffy's prophetic orchard dream was fulfilled. Well, unlike the Mercy Brown case, the details of this story were totally made up by a late Victorian historian. I mean, the family was real, and the children may have actually been exhumed on suspicion of vampirism, but the details are super wonky. Regardless, what's interesting is that this family, whose last name was actually Tillinghast, were related in some capacity to the Brown family, and also to another family, the Roses, who had their own fling with vampire exhumation. These folk beliefs in vampires and how to deal with them was easily spread through these tight-knit New England rural communities, through family ties and other such chains of connection. And why wouldn't you believe your family if you were in their shoes? Of course, New England is the most famous American locale for vampire history, but what you may not know is that Chicago has its own little spin with vampires too, around the same era. The year is 1888 in Lakeview, Chicago, and I need to introduce you to the main character of this story who started the craze in the first place. His name is Samuel Patton, a longtime resident of Chatsworth, Illinois, who was born in 1833. Patton had a wife named Nellie and was a well-respected mechanic and inventor, having developed a patent for a cornhusker. He apparently wasn't a weirdo at first, but he served in the Union Army in the Civil War, and judging by his letters that he wrote to Nellie at the time, He had an extremely rough service. He saw battle several times, spent several months in the hospital after drinking poison water, and was finally mustered out in Chicago in 1865. He then went back to blacksmithing in Chatsworth, but tragedy struck as all 5 of his children died in either infancy or before adulthood. This loss, combined with the trauma of his service, took a massive toll on his mental state, which was already not fantastic. Don't feel too bad for him though, because judging by his letters, he was also a huge racist. So, Patton would somehow end up back in Chicago, where he became obsessed with the supernatural. Locals referred to him as a mild-mannered, middle-aged gentleman with a high forehead and a bushy brown beard. But before long, he would be revealing some Samuel Patton lore that seemed a little bit off. According to the Chicago Tribune, when 10 years old, he saw a lantern-like light in a field, like a star of the first magnitude, which he watched for 2 hours. Patton also fought in the war, and while in the field had premonition dreams of strangers whom he later met when returning home. He had 5 children by the end of the Civil War, all of whom passed away at a young age. Willie Patton, the last to die, supposedly came out of his grave a week after he was buried. After marveling at spirit photography and experimenting with spirit manifestations, he began experiencing pain on his forehead, resulting from words being carved in from the spirit realm. This included his dead son's signature. After a while of this, he went to wearing a silk covering on his forehead, but the ghost would poke through it. He learned that the spirits had tortured and killed his children, and that they were not the race of humans, but made of cones and bubbles. Apparently, one would sing to him while poking his head, "Over there, where all is prayer, I'll sit and swear, hurrah for me, hurrah for me." After the spirits tired of poking him and singing, they sent a vampire after him. Ah, so Samuel's vampire appears. Yes, he became convinced that a vampire was responsible for the untimely deaths of his children, and now was following him. He relayed all this information one night in front of a crowd at a bookstore on Clybourne near Fullerton, owned by Judge Thalstrom in September of 1888. Thalstrom eagerly agreed with Patton's story, claiming that he too had heard true stories of vampires. This was when Patton dropped the kicker. He had invented a clairvoyant varnish that he would coat onto glass, which could be used to see the vampire floating through the air. The glasses he was selling came with a card reading, "Patton's clairvoyant varnish for glass develops a finer sight that enables a person, when looking through it, to see objects which are invisible. Specimens sent by mail on receipt of 10 cents. Address, Samuel Patton, 1297 North Paulina Street, Chicago, Illinois." The varnish apparently became very popular, but as time went on and nobody was seeing any flying vampire, the fervor died down. Until one night in November, when a man named Klaus Larson went missing. A local bartender told Mrs. Larson that Klaus had been at his bar the previous night and had seemed despondent, as if he sensed impending doom. Of course, it wasn't long before people in the neighborhood remembered the Lakeview vampire, and people really started freaking out. Mrs. Larson went to the police reporting that her husband had been taken by a vampire, and people took it upon themselves to go out looking for him. A group of young boys, calling themselves the Vampire Hunters, spent their Sunday creeping around the city cemetery in what is now Lincoln Park in search of the vampire himself. A little far south if you ask me, but whatever. I wanted it on the action, so I hopped on a plane to Chicago and joined forces with my college roommate and bestie Una to go look for this vampire in Lincoln Park like those boys did. Here's the thing. The city cemetery of Chicago no longer exists. It was destroyed when Lincoln Park was created. However, one tomb still remains, the mysterious couch tomb which sits behind the Chicago History Museum. This very well could have been a spot where those boys went to look for the vampire.
I keep laughing because the idea of a vampire, like, kidnapping some guy and then going on, like, a weekend bender is just so fucking funny to me. The idea of a vampire just going around, like, low-key terrorizing an entire community, but, like, not actually killing anybody. He's just pestering them. I really wish I could climb in there. I like to think, personally, that the vampire and Klaus Larson were gay lovers and they tried to run away, but then everybody was like scared about it, and so then he had to go home. But that's just my headcanon.
Now, the reason the couch tomb is still here isn't because there's a vampire in there. It's literally because it was too heavy and expensive to move, so they decided to leave it as a nice little reminder of the area's history. Needless to say, despite my very dedicated searching, I didn't find any flying vampire. Maybe it's because I didn't have the patent clairvoyant glass with me.
He's dead, I think.
We did, however, stop by the Chicago History Museum, where we did find a bunch of haunted dolls, so there you go.
Thank you, ladies. Have a good day.
Well, as it turns out, our friend Klaus Larson didn't go elope with a vampire, as much as I want to believe that. He sheepishly showed up back at home soon enough, admitting that he simply had gotten completely sloshed at the bar and had passed out. And as for Samuel Patton, well, he lived out the rest of his days in the government hospital for the insane in Washington, D.C., where he died in 1912. In the end, in all these stories, there never was any vampire all along. And what makes all of these cases a little bit confusing is actually how little they have to do with what we normally consider to be vampires. None of these victims had marks on their skin to denote feeding upon their blood, no one ever saw these alleged vampires outside of their graves, and the Lakeview vampire was more so accused of just kind of floating around and being a pest. But rather than coming to the conclusion that in the end these stories have nothing to do with vampires, what we really have to do is accept vampires as a sort of cultural spectrum. Get the images of Dracula and such out of your head and understand that as far as so-called real-life vampires go, no two stories are exactly the same because they're all informed separately by a continuum of local folk beliefs. Michael Bell writes in Food for the Dead, "In the ever-changing landscape of this danse macabre, creatures and concepts merge and blend, divide and disperse. Ultimately, what unites the seemingly diverse folk traditions is the belief that a corpse, possibly animated by an evil spirit, is responsible for an otherwise inexplicable sequence of deaths. Reduced to its common denominator, the vampire is a classic scapegoat. The corpses of Rachel Burton, Frederick Ransom, Lemuel and Alicia Ray, Nancy Young, Sarah Tillinghast, Ruth Ellen Rose, and Mercy Brown attracted attention at a time when consumption was threatening to decimate their communities, and they were singled out as the cause of that crisis. In that sense, they were vampires. But I still need to address the way that people talk about Mercy Brown and other alleged vampires, which they weren't. Over the years, many people have talked about Mercy and others to the media, adding in new spicy details that aren't part of her true story, in order to further cement the idea that she was a vampire or may still be one, to keep the mystery alive, because that's what people want to hear. Even some of Mercy's own family descendants have been complicit in this. Mercy was not a vampire. None of these people were. The mystery isn't open because there isn't one in the first place. So then, given what we know now, why did the fear of vampires and the urge to vanquish them last well into the 20th century and beyond? Okay. The history of real-life vampires, in particular in the West, is absolutely inseparable from real-life disease and folk medicine. You can't have one without the other. It's no coincidence that after Robert Koch announced in 1882 that he had discovered the bacteria that causes tuberculosis, vampire incidents declined steadily as less and less people died of consumption in general, and more people knew what was actually causing it. Around the same time, chemical embalming was gaining popularity, and so it became incredibly uncommon for people to be able to look at a body and tell if it's a vampire based on its decomposition. Because, well, they weren't decomposing. On purpose. It wasn't long before the publication of Dracula in 1897, and its subsequent rise to permanent mass media stardom in baby Hollywood, finally firmly placed the vampire and its supernatural monster friends permanently in the realm of fiction. But though our fascination with these old stories of alleged vampires has not entirely been overshadowed by fiction, as is evidenced by the prevalence in recent years of something you may have seen before: Victorian vampire defense kits. Now, I hate to be the bearer of bad news here. These things are bullshit. They're not real. I'm not talking about the obviously fake ones you can buy on Etsy, which are all just really fun, and I love those, but I'm talking about the ones selling at auction for thousands of dollars on the claim that they are genuinely from the 1800s. Like this one that sold earlier this year in the UK for $15,600, allegedly originally belonging to a certain Lord Hailey, a British administrator to India who died in 1969. Plenty of time for him to have made this after Dracula. Or these fancy sumbitches auctioned by Sterling Associates for between $6,500 to $9,000. Or this one you may have seen on Pawn Stars. But here's the thing. These kits are either fake or made much later than the 1800s, usually after all of these tools would have begun being associated with the vampire hunting thing in the first place. Most people in the Victorian era did not believe vampires were running around in need of being hunted because all of these real-life cases, as I discussed, were almost universally addressed within the realm of folk medicine. These kits are not properly authenticated, as evidenced by Sterling Associates' response to questioning on the matter from Vamps.org admin Anthony Hogg. We believe that the boxes and the elements contained in the boxes to be 19th century. We are not experts on vampire slaying kits. We are unaware of any manufacturer that fabricates these boxes, so the amount of research and the ability to research is limited. When they were assembled and if they were ever used to kill vampires is beyond our expertise. Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum, a notoriously trustworthy institution, has one of these kits on display, and when asked, they said that they couldn't find documentation of their existence earlier than the 90s. But they're definitely real though, guys, don't worry. Most of the people you'll see talking about these kits aren't even antiquarians or real historians or anything in the first place, and often they have a vampire-related something or other to sell you. In reality, these kits are a composite of various antique items and artificially aged add-ins, compiled nicely in a constructed box together. To really put the nail in the coffin, in 2005, a man named Michael DeWinter confessed on the now defunct survivalarts.com message board that he made a fake vampire hunting kit in the 70s to sell his pistol collection, and the trend tumbled from there. Whether or not it's true, we'll never know, because others have also come forward to claim that they started the trend, but regardless of who the true origin actually is, it's undeniable that these kits all began floating around after the publication of Dracula, and clearly none of them ever saw any action. As tough as it is to accept, real-life vampire hunting wasn't this glamorous thing. There were no real-life Van Helsings, people weren't going around stalking and destroying vampires in the dead of night, nor did they feel the need to defend themselves from them outside of folk superstitions. But these kits are poignant evidence of just how much fiction has not only influenced our conceptions of historical vampires, but completely overtaken them, and even further than that has resulted in a number of modern-day vampire crime cases. I won't get into this too deeply because it'll be its own video someday, but we'll do a quick overview. One good example is a case from 2005 when a Scotland man named Alan Menzies killed his friend Thomas McKendrick and drank his blood because, he said, the vampire queen Akasha from Anne Rice's book Queen of the Damned told him to. Another case just the year prior in Birmingham, England, saw reports of a vampire roaming the streets and attacking locals. The Birmingham Evening Mail reported, as the sun dips below the rooftops of sleepy terrace streets, residents rush home, quickly gathering up playing children because after night falls, a vampire hungry for blood stalks. Reports of a Dracula-style attacker on the loose biting innocent people has spread terror throughout neighborhoods in Birmingham, causing many to fear the darkness of night. Of course, there was no Dracula-style vampire on the streets of Birmingham, but people wanted to believe there was. Modern vampire tales aren't limited to Britain, though. Returning to Serbia, in 2007, a man named Miroslav Milosevic claimed to be a vampire hunter and drove a stake through the dead heart of the body of former Yugoslavian dictator Slobodan Milosevic, no relation. And in a case almost identically mirroring those of New England, in 2004, the body of a Transylvanian man named Tetra Toma was exhumed and his heart was cut out and burned and then fed to his niece, who, since his death, had claimed she was being tormented by apparitions of her uncle. But the most famous case of modern-day vampire hunting is arguably the case of the Highgate vampire in London, England. Around the 60s and 70s, people began witnessing a creature at Highgate Cemetery, dark and animalistic, with glowing red eyes and sharp teeth, but the form of a man. Two men, Sean Manchester and David Ferrant, separately took it upon themselves to become vampire hunters and competed to vanquish the Highgate vampire. Manchester was a Catholic priest on a mission to rid the world of vampire threats, and Ferrant was what he called a freelance vampire hunter, and in 1993 set up the Highgate Vampire Society in order to organize all data regarding this vampire case. Manchester claims he was asked to investigate by the sisters Anne and Louisa, after Louisa was found to be sleepwalking. One night, Manchester followed her as she sleepwalked towards a tomb in Highgate, where he says that a grey haze blurred his vision, and he heard a booming sound, and he quickly took Louisa home. Over the next few weeks, a large number of reports of varying ridiculousness cropped up one after the other, and claims of satanic and occult activity in the cemetery grew louder. And so, in March 1970, a wide group of wannabe vampires and spectators descended upon the cemetery as Manchester went in to exorcise the vampire. He claims that Louisa, while in a trance, led him to a particular tomb in Lebanon Circle, where he indeed found the vampire. But rather than staking it, he placed garlic, holy water, and a crucifix in the tomb, like that was gonna do anything. Of course, this didn't kill the vampire, and it allegedly went into hiding in a house on nearby Crescent Road, where Manchester later did claim that he staked and vanquished it for good. After this, no one ever saw the Highgate vampire ever again. Oh, jeez. It's fucking hot in here. Come on, LA, it's October, get your shit together. Michael Bell continues, "We derive comfort from giving tangible form to phenomena beyond our understanding. The monsters of folklore, including vampires, put a face on our fear of the unknown and help us explain and cope with the universe and the cycle of life and death. By personifying death and disease, we can more easily identify, objectify, and perhaps forestall one and eradicate the other. At the very least, seeing is relieving. In the end, throughout all non-fictional vampire mythology, there really is only one common link: fear of the dead. The idea of what a vampire is always evolving based on the particulars of the society it's in, but one thing is for certain: we don't actually want to vanquish them. If the case of false histories associated with the historical alleged vampires proves anything, it's that even when the vampire is killed, we still go to lengths to keep them around. The vampire is here to stay, no matter how long the hunt." Thank you for learning with me about the history of real-life vampire hunting. I can't wait to revisit more vampire topics in the future, so I hope you'll stick around if you want to learn more. So until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and don't forget to lock your window and keep a wreath of garlic about your neck. They are always watching, always waiting. When the stars go dark and the moon casts its pallid light across the earth, the accursed beasts in the form of those you once called friend arise from their desecrated tombs. They crave the blood which can never truly sustain them, for they are always wanting for more, toiling in their wicked depravity and thirst which can only be sated by feasting upon the living. Good night, sleep tight, but still on your guard, for the vampire has awoken, and they are hungry. Happy Halloween.